Okay, I'm going to attempt a narrow entry notch in this video. We'll see how it goes. It's a heat treated piece of chert. Now, the secret to this kind of notching is getting your preform very, very thin, especially on the edges. If you can do that, you've got half the battle won already. It's much easier to do the narrow entry with a very thin edge and a thin piece in general. Now, it's a point that's fairly common in California. We do have some in Texas, and I think there are other areas where there are arrowheads with narrow entry notches. But I think it's mainly a California thing. Win 2 type arrowheads and that sort of thing. We'll see how it goes. This one might have some imperfections in it, this piece, but I think it might work. It's not California stone either. I don't think I have, well, I have some stone that's similar. But I know a lot of these were made out of obsidian. And I think I made one on another video that had kind of expanding notches in it out of obsidian. I can't remember how long ago that was. But I'm going to try it tonight just because I was thinking about it recently. I'm going to make some more abo tools for my allergic hobbit channel. And I need to make a narrow entry notching tool out of antler or something. But I might as well get some practice on the actual point types before I actually do the abo videos. I won't be doing any more abo videos on this channel, but I'll be doing a bunch on my allergic hobbit channel coming up in the next month or so. Let's see if I have a different piece. Yeah, I don't know if I can recover from that one. So let's try this piece. It's definitely not ideal when you have a deep pocket of Cortex. But the material's nice. Now, what was I saying about the narrow entry notching tool with antler or an abo tool? I'm going to make it out of antler. It's going to be very thin. I made one out of steel just now before the video. I ground down the nail, very thin. But I'm going to make one out of elk antler. It'll be very thin as well. I'll have to probably make several to find which one is going to work. Not all antler is the same. It's not a consistent material. Some antler is harder than others, so I'll have to find, just by trial and error, which flaker will work the best to start the notch. Now, starting the notching is easiest on a thin edge. The thinner the edge, the better, because it will make it easy for the tool to make that first channel into the point, and then you can expand that channel later. And it's good to have a thin preform throughout the whole process, instead of having to try to thin as you're progressing into the notch. You don't want to be trying to thin while you're notching, like I do on some other points. With some points you can get away with thinning while you're notching, but the narrow entry is kind of a it's kind of a difficult thing, obviously. So having a thin preform makes everything easier, except for the fact that you've got to try to not snap the whole thing. One side of this is tougher than the other. I get spoiled on the good side, but then when I get to the bad side, I don't get long flakes. See, this is the nice side, just under the cortex, and this side is tougher, much tougher. I got to be careful I don't get too narrow. I won't have room to drive flakes. You know, I want to have a little bit of width to work with in case the first notching attempt doesn't work. I can just take the edge back and then start to notch over. And this is aggressive pressure. I was talking about in one of the other recent videos the difference between aggressive pressure and passive pressure. A lot of you guys seem to like that video. It had more views than the other two in that series. Or, yeah, I think it was 3 in that series. Anyway, I'll get into the passive pressure and stuff in other videos when I'm going to be going into making patterned flaking. I think I'll be doing an Eden point very soon, and then Scotts Bluff points, maybe some first view, and that sort of thing. I'll be doing it first with metal tools and then abo tools later. Yeah, everyone wants to see how it can be done with aboriginal or natural materials. Every time I do one with steel, you know, I show how it can be used. A lot of times a comment will come up, well, I wish I could see it also in natural material form. How does it compare? There's a learning curve between the two, between the metals and the natural materials. But basically, it's harder to do with natural materials because they wear out. They are not as strong as metal. As far as the actual techniques go in learning, it's about the same amount of effort. You know, once you get the hang of it. If you're brand new, it's going to take longer to do the abo stuff. But as you gain experience, adapting to it is a little bit quicker. That's why a lot of guys, I think, get frustrated they see other experienced nappers doing really well, you know, switching back and forth, or, you know, getting used to using antler or elbow tools quickly, and they're wondering why they can't do the same thing. Why can't I switch back and forth from copper to antler easily like these guys on video? Well, you've got to have a lot of experience in the basics first. And it gets easier. See, I get a lot of these type of flags with steel. The range is not quite as good as it is with aluminum or antler or copper. I think you guys can see that in the other videos too. It's not really that big of a deal. I'd rather have a shorter flake like this than an overshot. Now, very experienced nappers can thin and shape. You know, shape the outline and thin at the same time. But you don't have to be that. You don't have to. It's not mandatory. You can do one or the other. Thin and then shape, or shape and then thin. You don't have to do them at the same time. It just saves time if you can do them both together. So that's what I'm kind of doing here, shaping it and thinning it at the same time. And it's easier to do that with pressure than it is with the indirect percussion, I found. Although I can do it with indirect percussion, I can shape and thin at the same time. But somehow it's just easier mentally with pressure. And this is still all very aggressive pressure. I'm not doing any passive pressure right now. I'll do some passive pressure with the notching for sure. I might do some with this edge work. I think I'm going to do another pass with indirect percussion to get these lumps thinned down. Get this base thin. This is risky though. This is a kind of a long point. I'm not going very far. Risky in that I could snap the tip off hitting the base like this. A lot of times I would take the glove off at this stage, but since I'm hitting it really hard, I'm going to leave the glove on, just so I don't take off a tip of my fingernail. Yeah, this material is fairly tough, even though it's heat treated. I'm pretty sure it's heat treated. It has that waxy feel to it. It's still kind of tough. It's not a bad thing. The pressure flakes are running well on it, so I think I can thin it down the rest of the way with pressure. The object is to get it as thin as possible. Okay. Yeah, those pressure flakes are running pretty well, even with aggressive pressure. Okay, so I'll be doing some passive right now. That one was for some reason the platform gave way too soon. Yeah, the platforms are giving way a little bit too soon. But I just got to beef up the platforms. They've got to hold up to the pressure before it releases, or the passive pressure is not going to do any good. Yeah, that's better. You can't do a passive flake very well on a delicate edge. You got to have a nice seat for the pressure flaker. So it doesn't wipe out the platform before it has a chance to drive a long flake. You gotta be careful with these flakes that go up like this. If they go up toward the tip, it's risky because it can take the tip off. But I have a much better angle on it this way, even though I'm probably not supposed to be doing it that way. You know what I mean? Yeah, the passive pressure is working pretty good. All right. following ridges is a big help. Although it's not mandatory, it does help a lot, especially with patterned flaking. Following a ridge is much more predictable than just flicking across the high spot. But high spots are okay too. Like this is a high spot here. The difference between a high spot and a ridge is a high spot's smoother. See, I can put my flicker right there and flick across this high spot, maybe catch some of that ridge. But this is a ridge here and there and here. Those are easier to follow or more reliable. They might not be easier, but it's more reliable to follow a ridge. So if you have a nice flake pattern to begin with, it's easier to have a nice flake pattern at the end when you're finishing the point. So you can follow those ridges. Although I think I've seen some artifacts that the knappers are so good that they don't need to follow ridges. They just do this final pass with a lot of skill, and they just run the flakes across whatever is there. And the reason why I know that that happened that way is I can see some of them broke in manufacture. You can see a nice flake pattern on part of the point and then a really bad spot down below, right, where they haven't gotten to the flaking yet. And there's a lot of random flakes here, and then there's just a really nice flake pattern, and they snap it somewhere while they're putting a lot of pressure on it. So they're using a lot of pressure to overcome the bad areas on some of the ones that I've seen, but that requires a lot of practice. I'm not quite there yet. I can do a lot of that with the indirect percussion. I can blast through a lot of areas with indirect percussion, but with pressure, I'm still barely getting into that aspect. It's not too bad, but it's still not too good. It's a little bit thick for my taste in the middle there. I'm going to take a break and come back and see if I can get it really, really thin.